much do I put in this paper. I have another paper in which I suggest that you need to involve unions in other countries and global supply chains. Because I mean, there is this big work of global labor solidarity, which doesn't work. But I'm totally with you that it's not the knowledge; it's also the power structures. And I haven't emphasized this so much in this paper, but the sort of the justification for focusing on knowledge is that it sort of sets the stage for what kind of power relations you get, and then of course you can think about institutional design. But of course you're right that different power relations can then also lead to new forms of knowledge becoming available, accessible, and I'm probably maybe I'm totally in favor of workplace democracy, but very much worried about this being too much tied to the cooperation, not being applicable to global consummation and informal labor and all these things. So I think I agree with the general picture, and I didn't put it so much into the paper, but you're totally right that in the end the question is what are the institutional solutions that we can offer, and what are the power relations. And there was this wave of enthusiasm for just giving more information to consumers, labels, for example. It's not enough, but it's one element of the picture, and here I focus on that. But other than that, thank you so much for bringing that other dimension as well.
So we have 12 people on the queue, and I hope that at least 11 of them will be able to speak. I push myself down the road. The queue now looks, as it sounds like that, Rachel, Yam, Ralph, Katarina, Barak, Adi, Matush, Alon, Marietta, Merav, David, and Hanoch. Let's take them in a tour. I wanted to ask you if you allow that. And I will try to also give you some looks if you Rachel and then Yam. I can be intimidating. I tried.
I told you. She intentionally gave your looks.
So,
Rachel.
Lisa, thank you very much. This was a really interesting paper, and I think a really promising project overall. I have sort of three questions. The first is just a clarificatory one. It wasn't entirely clear to me in the paper how much work the distinction that you make between knowability in principle and knowability in practice is doing. I mean, it seems to me all knowability is a practical question, unless you're talking about some kind of genuine uncertainty, maybe, but it wasn't clear that that's what you were referring to, so I'd love to hear what substantive work that's doing. The second question is actually fairly broad and maybe beyond the scope of this particular paper, but you write very persuasively about the importance of institutional design and looking at the entire set of social institutions, of which markets are just one. And I would love to hear your thoughts about how you understand the sort of alternative to the standard neoclassical view that you're critiquing, right, which would say the state steps in where markets are not efficient. You're obviously arguing for something much more subtle and grounded and contextualized. What is the normative what normative principles would you use to distinguish then where the market ends and other institutions step in? Finally, I think this is kind of related to the second question. On your last section on the implications of big data on the epistemic conditions of markets, I wanted to ask actually how far you think the epistemic focus gets us normatively. Because if we think about, say, the insurance market, and there it seems the problem is not really that technology and new information precludes win-win transactions. It's that it allows win-win transactions for certain people but not others, and excludes those others from markets, and thereby also undermines political support for public provision of things like social insurance and other public goods. So if that's the case, then the problem is really not, the problem is the systemic effects of the new information situation. And then I wonder, does the epistemic framing that you're doing in this paper tell us what to do with that, or does it simply point to the need for other normative criteria in the design of markets?
Super. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much. I will speak here on behalf of the economists because I felt when I was reading your paper that we are missing an interdisciplinary dialogue, because I think that you're accusing, on that point, you're accusing mainstream economists for something they're not should be blamed for, because I think that information is actually the most central theme within economic theory for at least the last 50 years, if not more. And in fact, I think that I cannot have in mind any important economists who didn't try to deal exactly the issues that you're putting on, like that you're dealing with in the paper in their theory. And I can give just a few examples that I think everyone in the room knows. If we think about, concepts such as externalities, adverse selection, moral hazard, statistical discrimination, endogenous growth, and even, if we think about behavioral economics, well, their argument is that, people do not know what they're doing. I don't favor this argument. I think it's problematic. And to some extent, I think that economists are trying, just even sort of obsessed with the epistemical infrastructure of markets nowadays. I think about mechanism design, information design, and I think that we obviously have very, I agree with you totally that information is a really pose a great challenge today, this concept of information, and I completely agree with you that information and democracy are very related concepts, and that big data pose some challenges concerning the relationship between information control and democracy. So Hanoch is. So I'll finish it. I'll finish here. But I think that in this case, actually, the problem with economists, they're assuming that information, I guess, is too important, and maybe we have other things that plays roles that we need to address.
Great, thank you. I'll try to be brief, and there's more time over lunch, I guess. Knowability in principle versus practice. One is very much sort of what could experts that really get enough time and resources and so on know about something. And that can matter for institutional design because they can be hosted in some supervisory authority, for example. And the in practice thing is more what's a realistic take on what consumers in their everyday behaviors will actually have access to. And that's not the same as what the experts can know. And in the institutional design, you might have to shift more weight to regulatory oversight, because that's where you can really embed the insights of knowability in practice, which you just can't realistically expect to be taken up by people in their everyday lives. That's the basic idea here. Alternatives to your second question is sort of, that's the next book I want to write. I think the short answer is, what are the normative criteria for deciding between different institutions? Democratic values. That's what I want to argue. And then efficiency is sort of a second order criterion, but it's democratic values in the first place. What kind of economy does a democratic society want to have? And then markets are one of them, but there are lots of things where we can do better without others. And in the third one on the implications of big data, your question was, how much does the epistemic work do? I totally agree that normative work needs to be done by other arguments, but it's because of changes in the epistemic situation that this new normative situation comes up, because in a way, the impossibility of knowing your own risk had sort of forced people to be solidaric, even if they may not have wanted to, and now because of greater knowability of individual risk profiles, that sort of, maybe you could say artificial solidarity of, okay, we need to be all in the same insurance pool, that gets eroded through the new knowability. And that's why you then need to completely open up the normative questions again. So, and answer it through other criteria. Yeah, on economists, on the one hand, yes, you're right, there's a lot going on. But what I see, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, or maybe you can talk later, there's still a lot of focus on giving the rational consumer more knowledge and then trying to empower them as individuals. So it tends to be an individualistic focus. It tends to be a focus that wants to sort of heal markets, which maybe in this, I don't want this. When I was reading it, I was worried this paper might also come across a bit like I just want to save markets. That's not what I want. But insofar as we have markets, we need to save them. So, and so I think you need to have a much broader dialogue about other forms of knowledge in other institutional settings, the cost of provision and the funding of the information. And that's something where I would say that that's not really happening in economics so much. And I totally grant you that the behavioral perspective is very important, but it also only goes so far in looking at, okay, individuals have these heuristics and so on. What it doesn't look at, for example, is broader societal distortions of knowledge through, say, ideologies or kind of merchants of doubt scenarios. So again, the individualistic focus really limits the perspective.
Should we already move to 3?
Okay, too long.
No. Just if 3, then if we put myself aside, we'll be able to have everyone. So, Ralph, Katarina, and Barak.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. I have a question and a suggestion. I'll start with the suggestion. My sense as an outsider to both these fields was that Jan's point is correct, and that your presentation of economics is not accurate as it concerns economics. And one way to remedy that is to put more interdisciplinary effort into it. And another is, and that's the one I suggest, to put less interdisciplinary effort into it. To say,
Just not talk about it.
no, what I mean is the interdisciplinarity happens in the discourse. It happens here, it happens among papers. So you can say, from a philosophical perspective, and from the way we in philosophy discuss issues of markets, which we're more suspicious of than economists anyway. So to speak less about economists and say, well, this is how in my field the discourse is done, and how in my field I think there's actually something lacking, and I can bring in from your expertise the issue of knowledge which the others are underestimating. And then the economists can come and say, we know this already, and you can tell them, but you don't know it as well as I do. Or not in the way that I do, because the philosophical knowledge is a different one. So, but I mean to go back to your strengths, instead of trying to criticize the other discipline, which is also, I think it's also unnecessary for your argument. I think the argument works in itself and also satisfies mostly. Most economists wouldn't disagree. My own question starts from the beginning, and maybe I'll make it with your beginning example by Adam Smith. I didn't understand why that's a knowledge problem. The canal is either possible or not, so it's a binary issue. And the street is well possible or less possible, but it remains possible. And so the difference seems to me not one of knowledge, but one of, in one case you can't pass it all anymore, and then obviously you failed your duty. In the other, you can pass, it's just harder, but because it's a monopoly, you could still levy the same tax. And I wasn't sure why you view that as a knowledge problem, except as to whether they were negligent. But we don't care if they're negligent. If there's a strict liability issue, they have to keep the canals open, they have to keep the streets open. We don't worry about knowing their negligence. And it's a more general thing that I struggled with in the paper to some extent, where the distinction lies between knowledge and actual qualities of products themselves. So the blood diamond example, right? Whether they are from human rights breaking mines or not, is not a quality of the product, it's the knowledge about the background or something. But anything about diamonds is knowledge. Diamonds are just simple chemical stuff, and a lot of it is just something that we attribute to them. Right? So a lot of what we know about diamonds, about this, the role that diamonds have, that you have, how big the diamond is that you have to buy your spouse for their wedding, because they used to give you the exact size and price that you should pay for that, right? So on a more general level, your point is we have to control knowledge about facts, and I'm not sure where the distinction lies. For example, knowledge itself isn't also part of the facts, or many of the facts that we need to know about are themselves on the epistemic level. They're knowledge about knowledge, they're not knowledge about facts, or not knowledge about kind of hard facts.
David raised two fingers mean I'm crossing the line, but I speak very fast and very.
And I cede my time at the end.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I speak fast. And
on the canal road, you have knowledge from observation of the market action. The boat passes or doesn't pass. That's the binary. Whereas the road, you have a graduated thing. You can also have knowledge from dialogue or response. So you could have someone ask every carriage, was the road clear or not? But that leads to the self-dealing issues that came up with survey data and so on. Or you could have expert measurement. You send someone along the road, or you send someone to measure the amount of silt in the canal. Note that the silt level, and that would be a third party you can measure. In the silt level, Smith is wrong. You could have a silent rise of silt up to a threshold effect when no boats could pass, and the contractor could be not doing that. He's only clearing for the case where you have a wall collapse or a branch come across, I think, right? So there's knowledge that is not ascertainable by observation of the market. There's knowledge that's ascertainable either by observation or by dialogue, and there's knowledge only ascertainable by some kind of expert measurement. And you could use those different kinds to frame the paper at the start, because it captures a lot of your examples of the plurality of kinds of knowledge that markets do or don't participate in down the road. Done. You can take me off the end.
Dorina.
I just would like to raise the question about information and information governance as a tool to actually create market and legitimize market. So when I think about the history of financial regulation, we started with merit-based regulation, where you said certain things can't ever, go to the public, and then we all moved, or the US started moving into disclosure, especially in the 1930s, and I think this has then filtered into consumer. But by moving into consumer, you're actually legitimizing markets, because if we take the state out, all the state does is create the information that consumers we all know can't process. So I just want to question more fundamentally sort of the reliance on information and knowledge as a market legitimizing project.
Thank you. Oh, where does that say? Thank you, Ralph. The thing is, there isn't so much philosophy of markets talking about information. So yes, maybe I could say that there's little.
There's philosophy about markets that does not.
Yeah, that does not speak about it. That's right.
So that's where your contribution lies.
Yeah, but maybe I should actually go down the road that Jan suggested and include a bit more and acknowledge what economists are doing. I need to think about it, and I need to think about the word limit. On this distinction between knowledge and actual qualities of products. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, and I distinguish this when I speak about efficiency versus other standards of normative evaluation, is that these products are part of causal chains where they do harm in the diamond case. And the question is, does this knowledge about them travel with them, with the pure material objects? And just to give you another example, there was this case in the UK where it looked like some of these seamstresses in Bangladesh had stitched a message of this has been done with exploitative labor or something into a t-shirt. It was actually done by an NGO to make a fuss and raise awareness, but it seemed at first, this would have been a case where the knowledge about the production conditions would have traveled with the actual material object. Now, insofar the question, it didn't in this case, no.
That tells you something that it didn't.
No.
Shut up.
No, but the point is that I'm assuming that from a normative perspective, and consumers don't always act on this, totally agree, more than just the material product matters. What matters is also sort of the normative quality that a product gets by being part of certain causal chains. And it's the knowledge about these things that matters. What might also play a role, and for blood diamonds, maybe that's part of the story, is that that kind of knowledge becomes itself part of sort of the value and the symbolism of products. Who would want to give a blood diamond to their fiancé? So you could say that there's an assumption that it's not a blood diamond that itself plays a role in what we mean by the product itself. That's why the line is sometimes hard to draw, but for me what really matters is this knowledge about the broader implications that matters for the normative evaluation of a piece of mineral in the end. Now on the canal example, I think Smith did actually read it such that it's also applicable to still building up, and the assumption is that this would harm the entrepreneur so much because then the canal would be stuck that they have the incentive to dig it out from time to time.
Depends on the length of the contractor provision.
Right.
Shorter would
Yeah, well,
allow them to
I
gain it.
think that's something I need to go back to the text, but I think he was assuming renewable contracts. And so in that sense, he was endogenizing that very question, and that's what I find so interesting about it. That no one needs to. You don't need the expert knowledge, and you don't need the surveys because it's in the thing itself. You see whether it works or not. And what you say about asking people and knowledge from experts, that's of course what happens in lots of other markets because it's not self-enforcing in the same way. So I could probably already introduce it there, yeah. I'll think about it. Information as legitimizing market, yeah, I think that's correct as an observation. It goes hand in hand with a story about autonomy and freedom and choice. I mean, the concept of choice doesn't make sense without certain assumptions about that you know what you're choosing from. And in a way, but maybe I need to make this clear, I thought that this was sort of part of the story here that you put so much emphasis on the legitimizing force of consent, and thereby, from a philosophical perspective, you actually shift the question to is that consent normatively able to carry the weight it's supposed to carry? And one, not the only, but one of the key factors is then the source of information. And in that sense, I'm implicitly criticizing what you're saying, but you just tell people, okay, you know enough, so it can be a market. That's often actually not empirically true, and also normatively then problematic. So I'm not sure whether we have a dissent here.
No, I don't think we have a dissent. I think I just want to bring it out a little bit more.
Okay, yeah.
Because I think, what you said before, maybe democracy should decide what are good markets and bad markets. And I think we've had actually in the past many more criteria to do this, but we've sort of shifted into this illusion, I would say, of the ability of all people to make these choices on all kinds of matters, and therefore have legitimized the market mechanism.
I mean, the healthcare would be an example, because in healthcare it's pretty clear that usually we don't know enough that the market is the obvious choice, and yet it was very much this rhetoric, patients need to have choice, and this would be an example.
You should decide whether we should continue with the
Yes,
three
please,
or
we
take
all,
everyone.
take all, yes.
Okay, Barak.
Okay, so continuing with the theme of three, I have 3 points, or 3 kinds of distinctions. One is, and it could be because I misunderstood the paper, there's a distinction between exploiting the consumer, in that sense, the market's not working, the market is not meeting the consumer where it is not meeting certain consumer preferences, in which case you want to fix the market, you want to create more surplus, you want to be more attentive to what consumers care about. Versus this activity like slave labor or something that you're trying to fix. And maybe you're trying to do it through market mechanisms. Sometimes that works, very often it doesn't. Sometimes it legitimates, maybe so that it might be counterproductive. But to the degree that, I guess I was a little confused. I thought that Hila misunderstood your paper, and now I think I might have misunderstood your paper. Because Hila was talking about like basically an ill, call it an externality or whatever, that misinformation to consumers is enabling. And I actually thought it was misinformation to consumers that was the problem. But at the very least, those are 2 different problems that might involve 2 different solutions. The second distinction is information about products and information created in markets. Most products have certain unverifiable qualities. And what we try to do is we try to create markets to solve that problem. And sometimes markets do a reasonably good job, and sometimes markets do a bad job. You might say that we've solved the lemons problem because we have brands. That's a reasonably good solution to the problem. Again, it's not the problem of exploiting car manufacturer labor. It's the problem of manipulating or taking advantage of consumers. And some market solutions, like the Kimberley process, for example, we have not done a good job. I mean, the Kimberley process is basically an organized cartel that doesn't effectively target blood diamonds. It effectively targets low-cost diamond producers. Healthcare is another great example. Healthcare is a very significant information asymmetry. And Arrow said, well, that's why we have professional societies and trust, but to a large degree, that undermines consumer choice and it undermines competition, and to a large degree, we conflate good doctors with bad doctors, and consume too much from both. So if the problem, by identifying I think you're talking about unknowable qualities in a particular product, and then the market is a way, or market construction, market design, this is where the economics for the last 50 years is trying to come into place, trying to solve the problem. And the third distinction, and this I think is really intriguing, is your observation at the end of the reciprocity or the bidirectionality of the problem. If we think that giving more information to consumers is a good idea, why wouldn't we think that giving more information to producers is a good idea? That solves the adverse selection problem. In fact, actually, the cost of advertising has gone way down. You can call that restricting markets, but to some degree, we're still troubled by it. I think that's a problem that's seriously under-theorized, but maybe that's really where you could make a cool contribution. I mean, maybe there's an analog where giving a consumer too much information leads to bad solutions. Like maybe, Buy American is just leading to nativism. And that kind of information is leading to a socially undesirable outcome. But that I think was the most intriguing part of the paper, thinking about what implications there are for, we have some untheorized but very meaningful concern about over-information about consumers, and maybe there's some reciprocal concern about producers.
Adi.
Thank you very much. So I really liked the paper, and my point was also about the issue of over-information, so it's a good segue. But I was wondering about maybe a distinction between how information functions for consumers as opposed to regulators in this regard. And one of the things that I was wondering is, at some point you say that maybe regulators have a duty to seek more information, maybe as opposed to consumers, I guess. But I'm wondering whether, what about the duty to consider information? If you have, assuming that you have, your worry seems to be more about not having enough information, or maybe not having the mechanisms to produce the relevant information. But I'm thinking more about the other extreme, maybe, where there is so much information and people just eventually, consumers, defer authority to decision making to some external, and we see this in other contexts, for example, in healthcare, that people, in genetic testing, for example, too much information, people just defer to another decision-making authority. And so my question is whether you have any thoughts about how this may imply or affect the issue of institutional design. Maybe regulators have a different duty or should function differently in this situation.
Yes, so a very brief question, and in fact it's very much connected to the previous one. So yes, so I would like to ask you about the question about the like overflow of information in the economy, and who should be in charge of selecting the information that are relevant or irrelevant, or the information that are important or unimportant? Because in your paper you are talking what information should be considered, but mostly from the perspective of distinguishing them from the information that cannot be considered on ethical or legal grounds. So, for example, information about some intimate intrinsic elements of human personality, for example, shouldn't be taken into account in personalizing the advertisements. But just to reverse this question, who should be in charge of, let's say, separating the signal from the noise?
Hello.
So, a series of quick follow-ups. First, the Germany Supply Act law could be really helpful in seeing new ways of. It's really not consumer-centered, and I think there's something that could be interesting to you to think through that act. Regarding the two readings of whether it's a consumer-oriented paper or not, or stakeholder paper. So you allude to Zuboff, and for Zuboff, Amazon is the right kind of capitalism. And she said, like, she distinguished between Facebook and Google, and you have Apple and Amazon. Then she said, well, Alexa is a problem. They're moving to surveillance. But then, no, it's not about the Alexa that's moving to surveillance. It's the apparatus of the worker and supply chain. And so there's a tension there that I think that could help, also helpful to think about the distinction between is it a consumer oriented project or not. 30 is STS and Michel Calon, Making of Markets, Justin Hoff, Sing Like a State, all those discourses about knowledge production and the role of materiality in the question in regards to Ralph's question about whether it's the product themselves or is it just the knowledge of it and how we think about them. So there's something there that might be helpful also to think through on that notion. And lastly, I have a friend in the diamond IT industry, and it's unbelievably what they don't know about their own products.
Marietta, we're almost there.
Yes, so I'll limit myself to 2 points which I think haven't been mentioned yet. First is methodological. So you said, okay, you're aiming at a normative agenda here, making normative claims. Fine, but I was a bit puzzled how the empirical, analytical points you made throughout the paper fit in with the normative. So it's like, I didn't really get where one ends and the other starts. Maybe this should be made more clearly, especially regarding what we heard, that really, when you really get into what has to be done normatively, the devil is really the detail. So especially like so the supply chain reliability. And what I also didn't get is the paper carries the title Markets and their historicity. So where's the historical aspect? So this can all be done without any historical insight here. It's all empirical, analytic, normative, based on normative. The second point is I would turn to pages 18 to 20, where it's all about the algorithmic discrimination, digital big data issues. I think you made the point stronger that producers shouldn't know all about consumers, but this is not only about their behavioral aspect or how they behave or sort of behavioral limitations, but this is straightforwardly about gender, race, etc. Whatever. Why do producers have to know that? Because that's sort of the key issue of algorithmic discrimination. And page 1920, I would again sort of work over this issue of the privacy paradox, because when you move on with the argument, you get into not reading boilerplate, but that's sort of a really common legal problem, and that's actually a rational difference. So one doesn't really have to read into one. That's it.
Last but not least, yeah.
Okay, so I keep changing my thoughts as the discussion goes, so maybe it's good if I'm next. So I'll also have quick follow-ups on what folks have been saying. So first on, Katrina's information is a market legitimizing tool, and on Barak's analogies between, whether we should be as concerned about consumers having too much information as we are about sellers having too much information. So I think, my conclusion from this debate, but it's of course a tentative one, is that maybe we should teach the more information is always better mantra, both with respect to how we think about consumers and about sellers, right? It doesn't work in either case. But I don't think we should be as pessimistic into saying disclosure would never work and we should find other solutions. We can think about maybe a more nuanced approach to disclosure mandates and to disclosure regulation, more tailored, more context-dependent approach, which I think should be backed by empirical, and some of the people would not be surprised. I think it should be backed by systematic empirical research. I do share Lisa's intuition that for consent, if we still care about consent, and that's a question I think in consumer contracts, but if we still want, to have a meaningful consent, then it has to be informed in some sense. But at the same time, we do know that consumers, humans, have limited cognitive abilities, and we do suffer from information overload, especially in the era of big data. And we know that sellers have incentives sometimes to undermine the whole purpose of the regulation. So we should think more deeply about what information should be conveyed and how it should be contained. So I'll just stop by suggesting 3 dimensions or distinctions that we probably should be thinking about. So one is, and it was already mentioned, right, the costs of compliance. And here we may want to distinguish between information that firms collect anyway, and as Hila said, some of the information we now want firms to convey, to disclose, is not collected anyway, right? And firms sometimes even having perverse incentives not to collect. So that's one, it affects the costs of compliance. But there is information available, for example, on news patterns. Let's say the mobile phone industry, they collect these data for commercial purposes. They know how much we use our phones. If they disclose that information, we can shift to more efficient packages. And there's empirical research suggesting that most of us do not use the most efficient package conducted by Oren, Bardi, and Rebecca Stone. And the second dimension is the effect on consumer behavior. Also has been mentioned. But I think that maybe one thing that hasn't been mentioned is that disclosure can also affect sellers' behavior. So even if we do not see what we wanted to see in terms of consumers changing their behavior, maybe disclosure will force sellers to behave more. I get the looks from so I say more fair.
So maybe the third dimension, as well as whatever comment I would have, will stay for the break, but you should have the last word.
Oh gosh, thank you so much.
You just have 1 minute for 75 comments.
So one thing to say is that this idea that more information is always better was very much coming from, and this connects to David's paper, from the idea that in a perfect market system, with more information, you can close more inefficiency gaps because you can have more trading and you can have deepen the possibility for efficient allocation. So in that sense, it's a trade-off. And what I have briefly in the paper is that there is also a need to then really distinguish, which I don't really do, but clever, well-informed consumers can benefit a lot more from more information being available, whereas consumers under scarcity of time or money or whatever, I'm not saying they're less intellectually capable, I'm just saying all of us are often in situations where we are not these rational consumers, then we want more protection. And I mean, one strategy, which I think is partly used in many markets, solves lots of these issues, is to have one default offer that has a lot of public supervision that people can choose, and then the opportunity to deviate a bit from that. Because then you create a kind of, what's Schelling's term, a kind of focal point where there are lots of public attention will go to, and anchoring for consumers. So that solves many of these issues. Where's the historical aspect? That's something I wanted to pick up. I mean, all these mechanisms for how knowledge gets generated, distributed, and so on, have a historical index. And that's the historical dimension in the sense that, I mean, I could have gone into sort of historically drawing out how certain markets changed because of how technologies became more available. I mean, financial markets and IT is the poster child story for that. The markets became only possible because of the IT opportunities to share knowledge much faster than when it was all paper-based. I'll stop here, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much.